My boyfriend said, "I told the adoption agency you have a criminal record. We won't get approved now, and I don't want kids anyway." We had already been in the process for 8 months. 8 months of paperwork stacked across our dining table, interviews scheduled around work, parenting classes on weekends, background checks, financial disclosures, reference letters, home study visits, fingerprints, training modules. 8 months of building something I thought was real. I looked at him and said very quietly, "That's fraud." What I remember most isn't even the sentence. It's his face. Not ashamed. Not devastated. Annoyed. Like I was making a manageable inconvenience sound dramatic. That was the moment something in me shifted. Not shattered. Shifted. Because heartbreak feels different when betrayal arrives wearing practicality. My name is Natalie Grace Mercer. I'm 35 years old, and I'm a middle school special education teacher. I've been teaching for 11 years. The kids in my classroom are usually the ones adults describe with tired voices. Too difficult. Too emotional. Too disruptive. Too far behind. I've always hated that language. Children are not broken appliances. Some of them are just carrying more than their bodies were ever meant to carry. Learning disabilities, behavioral challenges, emotional disorders. Kids who learned chaos before they learned multiplication. I understand them better than most people realize, because I was one of them. I make $56,000 a year. That is not a glamorous number when you're trying to adopt. I knew that. I knew every terrifying number involved in this process. Every fee, every timeline, every if approved. Because adoption was never some random someday fantasy for me. I had been researching it since I was 28. And that story starts much earlier. I entered foster care when I was 7. I still remember the smell of the social worker's car. That weird combination of stale air freshener, coffee, and old paperwork. I remember sitting in the back seat, clutching a trash bag with my clothes in it, trying to understand why adults kept using calm voices to explain things that felt like the end of the world. I bounced through 4 homes before I landed with a family that actually wanted me when I was 11. They were good people, kind, steady, older. Their own children were already grown. They never legally adopted me, not because they didn't care, because life got complicated. Money, paperwork, fear, timing. Whatever combination of adult reasons makes a child hear the same outcome. Not officially, but they kept me. They came to my graduations. They called on birthdays. They loved me in all the ways that mattered emotionally. But legally, I was never anyone's daughter. That does something to a person. It leaves this strange ache you don't fully know how to explain. The feeling of being loved, but still somehow temporary. Wanted, but never fully claimed. That feeling shaped everything. Why I became a teacher. Why I notice the kids who act angry when they're actually terrified. Why I stay patient longer than most people would. And why, for years, I knew I wanted to adopt. Not rescue. Not save. I hate that language. I simply wanted to become the stable adult I once needed. That's it. Then Adrian came into my life. My boyfriend. 2.5 years together. Certified paralegal. Sharp, organized, calm under pressure. The kind of man who alphabetized paperwork without being asked. At first, that felt reassuring. When we talked about children early in the relationship, I was brutally honest. I told him adoption was not optional for me. Not because I was inflexible, because I knew myself. I needed a partner who genuinely wanted that future. He looked me in the eyes and said, "You're going to be an incredible mother." I believed him. Maybe that's the cruelest part. Not that he lied. That I trusted the lie enough to build around it. When we officially started the adoption process, Adrian was involved in everything. Everything. The agency interviews, the home study, training hours, parenting education, trauma-informed care sessions, attachment theory, infant development, behavioral transitions, all the emotionally exhausting material that forces you to think hard about what parenting actually means. He showed up. He asked thoughtful questions. He helped organize documents. He sat beside me while I talked about foster care during interviews, held my hand when I got emotional, even helped choose photos for our profile book. One photo from outside my school, one in the apartment, one with my foster parents. I remember him pointing at that one and saying softly, "This makes you look safe." That word got to me. Safe. Because that was always the dream. To be safe for someone. The agency explained the timeline clearly. Approval could take 4 to 6 months. After that, waiting for placement could be much longer. I understood. Waiting was familiar territory. At first, Adrian seemed genuinely excited. He talked about the second bedroom, baby-proofing cabinets, books we could save from my classroom, little comments about the future that felt ordinary and warm. Then something changed. Subtle at first. He stopped asking about updates, started leaving the room when I brought up agency emails, got quiet whenever finances came up, spent longer staring at his phone at night, emotionally somewhere else before physically going anywhere. I noticed. Of course I noticed. But love makes people generous with explanations. I told myself he was stressed, that the process was overwhelming, that fear was normal, that patience mattered. Then, 3 weeks before our expected approval decision, he sat across from me while I was grading papers at the kitchen table. He looked pale. Not guilty. Cornered. Like someone who had rehearsed a confession but not the fallout. He said, I need to tell you something, and you're going to be upset. I put my pen down. Okay. He swallowed. Then, I called the agency last week. My stomach tightened immediately. What do you mean? He glanced at the adoption binder between us. 8 months of our lives in color-coded tabs. Then he said it. I told them you have a criminal record. The room went silent in that strange, hyper-detailed way shock works. I heard the refrigerator hum. A car outside. My own breathing. I don't have a criminal record. I know. That was the part that made my skin go cold. Not the accusation. The casual certainty. Then why would you say that? He finally looked at me. Because I don't want to do this anymore. The sentence landed strangely softly. Almost polite. I don't want kids, he said. I never really did. I thought maybe I could get there for you, but I can't. The longer this went on, the more trapped I felt. I just stared at him. Because heartbreak sometimes arrives too large for immediate language. Finally, you could have told me. I was afraid you'd leave. I laughed once. A small broken sound. So instead you lied to a licensed adoption agency? I just needed to slow things down. What exactly did you tell them? He hesitated. Which told me everything. Then, I said you failed to disclose a misdemeanor assault charge from college. For a second, I genuinely forgot how to breathe. You told them I hid a violent criminal record? I didn't say violent. Adrian, assault is violent. He looked irritated. Actually irritated. Like I was nitpicking wording instead of reacting appropriately to sabotage. I panicked. No. My voice came out colder than I expected. You planned. He flinched. And in that moment, I saw him differently. Not as the man I loved. As the man who sat beside me through trauma interviews, listened to my childhood, understood exactly what adoption meant to me, and weaponized that knowledge. I said it again, slowly, clearly. That's fraud. Stop calling it that. It is fraud. It was one phone call. It was a knowingly false statement during an active adoption process. He stood. You're making me sound criminal. No, I said, you handled that part yourself. Silence. Then, what are you going to do? I looked at the binder, the profile photos, the training certificates. 8 months of hope. Then back at him. I'm calling the agency in the morning. His jaw tightened. If you do that, we're done. I looked at him for a long moment, then said the only honest thing left. We already are. Adrian slept in the guest room that night. I didn't sleep at all. I sat alone at the kitchen table long after midnight, staring at the adoption binder like it belonged to strangers instead of us. The mug of coffee beside me went cold, then got reheated, then went cold again. At some point, I stopped noticing. 8 months. 8 months of paperwork, interviews, fingerprints, training certificates, reference letters, financial disclosures, and conversations about a future I had believed we were building together. What hurt most wasn't just what he'd done. It was how many memories suddenly felt counterfeit. The parenting classes where he squeezed my hand when I got emotional talking about foster care. The evenings we sat on the couch discussing practical things like school districts and childcare costs. The way he once casually asked whether we should keep some of the books my students had outgrown, because maybe our kid would like them someday. I kept replaying everything, looking for the moment I should have known. The exact second sincerity became performance. But betrayal rarely announces itself clearly while it's happening. Most of the time, it only becomes obvious in hindsight when every small discomfort suddenly rearranges itself into a pattern. By 8 the next morning, I was sitting in my car in the school parking lot with my phone in my hand, forcing myself to breathe before making the call. When Melissa, our assigned caseworker, answered, her voice was calm and professional in the practiced way of someone who spends her days managing emotionally fragile situations. I introduced myself, then said, I need to report something. And once I started talking, I didn't stop. I told her Adrian had contacted the agency. I explained the fabricated criminal allegation. I explained that I had no criminal record, that their own background check had already confirmed that months earlier. There was a pause on the other end. Then Melissa said carefully, we did receive a concerning communication. Even though I had already known the answer, hearing confirmation made something inside me sink. Because until that moment, some irrational part of me had still hoped Adrian was bluffing. That maybe he had said something cruel in anger just to hurt me. But no, he had actually done it. He had picked up the phone and deliberately tried to damage my application. What happens now? I asked. Melissa explained that because the allegation came from someone officially listed on my application as a co-parent, the agency had no choice but to flag the file for review. Even with a clean background check already on record, protocol required documentation and internal evaluation, which meant delays, additional scrutiny, more waiting. Exactly what Adrian had wanted. I closed my eyes and pressed my forehead briefly against the steering wheel. How long? Several weeks at minimum. That hurt, but not as much as what I had to say next. My boyfriend and I are no longer together. Melissa went quiet. Then I continued before I could lose courage. I want to continue the adoption process as a single applicant. This time the silence lasted longer. Not judgment. Practical recalculation. Finally, she said gently, Natalie, I need to be honest with you. Moving from a joint application to a single applicant means parts of the process will need to restart. I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. New home study, updated financial review, revised applicant profile. I understand. And as a single applicant, the process may become more difficult. I understand. Then came the question that hit harder than I expected. Are you sure you want to continue? Not because it was offensive, because it was fair. This wasn't just paperwork anymore. This was someone asking whether I still had the emotional strength to keep fighting for something. After the person closest to me had tried to sabotage it, I swallowed hard before answering. I grew up in foster care. Melissa stayed silent. I know exactly what it feels like to spend childhood waiting for permanence that never fully arrives. My voice trembled, but I kept going. I have wanted to do this for years. I am not walking away because one man lied about me. There was a quiet pause. Then Melissa said, "Understood." Her tone shifted slightly after that. Still professional, but warmer. She explained the agency would document the false allegation in the file, not against me, but as contextual protection, establishing that interference had occurred and been investigated. Then she added something important. The agency takes knowingly false statements very seriously. I sat up straighter. What does that mean? It means interference with an active child placement process may trigger formal review. The implication was clear. Adrian's actions might create consequences for him beyond our breakup. When the call ended, I sat in my car for several minutes and cried. Not dramatically, not loudly, just the kind of exhausted crying that happens when your body has been holding tension for too long and finally gives up pretending it's okay. Then I wiped my face, fixed my makeup, grabbed my work bag, and walked into school. Because adulthood is cruel that way. Your life can be actively collapsing, and someone will still need help understanding reading comprehension at 9:15 in the morning. When I got home, Adrian was gone. Not permanently yet. Just absent. His clothes were still there, his shoes were still by the door, his coffee mug was still in the sink. But he wasn't. He had texted that he was staying with his parents to give us space. That word nearly made me laugh. Us. As if he hadn't detonated the entire relationship the night before. Over the next few days, his mother came with an SUV while I was at work, and they packed his belongings. When I came home, his key was sitting on the kitchen counter beside a handwritten note. It said, "You're choosing a hypothetical child over a real relationship. I hope it's worth it." I read it 3 times. Not because I didn't understand it. Because I couldn't believe someone who had claimed to love me could reduce this dream to something so casually cruel. Hypothetical child? Maybe technically yes. But somewhere, there were children already waiting. Children sitting in foster homes, temporary placements, uncertain systems. Children who absolutely existed. Children who knew exactly what uncertainty felt like. I dropped the note into the recycling bin. Then I cleaned the counter where his key had been sitting. As if removing the physical evidence might make the emotional residue easier to handle. I thought maybe that would be the end of it. I was wrong. A week later, Adrian's mother called. I recognized the number immediately and considered letting it ring out, but some stubborn part of me answered anyway. Maybe because I still believed, irrationally, that someone in his family might acknowledge how wrong this had been. Instead, the moment she spoke, I knew exactly how the conversation would go. "Natalie," she said, already sounding irritated, "I think you're overreacting." I leaned back in my chair at work and stared at the ceiling for a second before responding. About which part? All of it. The breakup, the adoption, the legal threats. Adrian made a mistake. Your son deliberately lied to a licensed adoption agency. He panicked. He fabricated a criminal allegation. He felt trapped. That word again. Trapped. As if honesty had somehow been unavailable to him. I let out a short breath that almost sounded like laughter. He could have left. He loved you. There was something surreal about hearing that sentence from a woman whose son had just tried to sabotage the single most important process of my adult life. "No," I said calmly. "People who love you do not try to destroy your future because telling the truth feels uncomfortable." She went quiet for a beat, then shifted tactics. "This whole single woman adoption thing, do you have any idea how that looks?" And there it was. Not concern. Judgment. The kind wrapped in fake practicality. "I don't care how it looks. A child needs a father. A child needs consistency. You're being stubborn. I'm being clear." She exhaled sharply, muttered something under her breath, and hung up. I sat there for a moment afterward, strangely calm. Because once someone shows you exactly how they think, there's a certain relief in no longer having to guess. I thought that would be the final, unpleasant surprise. 3 days later, I got an email from the agency. The subject line read, "Urgent Case Documentation Update." The second I saw it, something cold moved through my chest. I opened it immediately. Read the first line. Then the second. Then the third. And by the time I reached the end, I was so still I could hear my own heartbeat. Adrian had contacted them again. This time, he wasn't claiming I had a criminal record. He was expressing concerns about my emotional stability following the breakup. According to him, I was going through some kind of emotional crisis, and he believed placing a child with me would be irresponsible. I reread the email twice because the sheer audacity of it was difficult to process. The first lie had already been unforgivable. This was something worse, because now it was no longer panic, no longer fear, no longer a terrible impulsive decision he regretted. This was a deliberate second attempt. Calculated. Retaliatory. He had watched me continue without him, and instead of accepting that, he had decided to become an obstacle. I called Melissa immediately. This is retaliation. Her voice remained measured. We are documenting all communications. That's not enough. I understand you're upset. No, I said quietly. I'm past upset. And I meant it. Upset is what you feel when someone disappoints you. This was something colder, clearer. This was the realization that someone you once loved had decided your suffering was acceptable collateral damage. Melissa explained that because the agency already had the first documented false allegation, this second contact reinforced a visible interference pattern. But official protocol still required documentation. Procedure. Review. Record keeping. Normally, bureaucracy is maddening. That day it felt protective, because documentation meant facts existed outside emotion. It meant Adrian couldn't simply invent a new version of me every time he felt angry. Still, I knew I needed stronger protection. That afternoon, I contacted a family law attorney recommended by a coworker. The consultation alone cost $250, which, on a teacher's salary, is not an amount you spend casually. I sat in his office and told the entire story from the beginning. The adoption, the sabotage, the breakup, the second false report. He listened carefully, then folded his hands and said, "There are two important things here." I waited. First, knowingly making repeated false statements intended to interfere with an adoption process can create legal exposure. For the first time in days, I felt something close to relief, because Adrian and his mother had worked very hard to make me feel like I was being dramatic, that I was emotionally overreacting, that this was relationship fallout, not misconduct. Hearing a professional describe it differently mattered more than I expected. Second, the attorney continued, the agency may choose to take independent action if they believe the integrity of their evaluation process has been compromised. That mattered too, because this had never just been about me. This was interference with a process designed to protect children. What do you recommend? I asked. Cease and desist. How much? About $400. I laughed. Not because anything was funny, because betrayal is apparently expensive. By the time everything was finalized, the total came closer to $650. $650 to formally tell the man who once promised I'd be an incredible mother to stop lying about me. The letter was sent within the week. It stated clearly that any further attempts to interfere with my adoption application would be treated as harassment and intentional interference, with potential escalation if necessary. And apparently legal language succeeded where decency had failed. Because after that, silence. No more calls. No more sudden concerns. No more sabotage. For the first time in weeks, I could breathe without expecting the next attack. Not fully, but enough. The process restarted, and this time I was doing it alone. The new home study happened about a month later, and the emotional difference between this visit and the first one was impossible to ignore. The first time, Adrian had been there beside me. We had answered questions together, presented ourselves as a couple, talked about parenting as if it were a shared destination we were walking toward, side by side. This time it was just me. Same apartment, same walls, same second bedroom, but everything felt different, quieter, sharper, like the emotional furniture had changed, even if the physical furniture hadn't. The social worker arrived on a rainy Tuesday afternoon carrying the same clipboard, the same practiced professional calm, but I was not the same person she had met before. I had become more tired, more careful, and in a strange way, clearer. She began with practical questions. Income, work schedule, emergency contacts, support system, who would help in a crisis, how flexible was my job, what childcare options would I realistically rely on. The kind of questions that sound clinical on paper, but actually cut straight into the most vulnerable parts of your life. Because answering them honestly means admitting exactly where you are strong and exactly where you are not. Eventually, she set her pen down and asked, "Tell me what happened." Not vaguely, not politely, directly. So I did. I told her everything. Adrian's confession, the fabricated criminal allegation, the second false report about my emotional stability, the cease and desist letter, his mother's calls, the breakup, all of it. I expected skepticism, maybe not outright distrust, but some cautious professional distance. Instead, she listened quietly and nodded once. It's all documented. For some reason, hearing that comforted me more than I expected. Because facts mattered. Facts meant I wasn't standing there, trying to convince someone of a private emotional narrative. The truth already existed on paper. Then she asked the question that stayed with me long after she left. What makes you believe you can do this alone? It wasn't insulting. It was exactly the right question. And because it was the right question, I took a moment before answering. I looked around the apartment first, at the couch where I graded papers, the bookshelf cluttered with novels, student thank you cards, and half-finished lesson planning materials. The kitchen where I had once imagined family breakfasts with someone who turned out not to belong in that future. Then I looked back at her. I was alone for a lot of my childhood. She stayed quiet, so I kept going. I don't mean that dramatically, I mean literally. I folded my hands in my lap. I know what instability feels like. I know what unpredictability feels like. I know what it feels like when the adults in your life feel temporary. Saying it out loud felt strangely grounding. Painful, yes, but grounding. Not because nobody ever cared, I continued, but because caring and permanence are not always the same thing. She listened without interrupting, and for the first time in a long time, I felt no pressure to make my story sound prettier than it was. I also know how much one consistent adult can change a child's entire life. That part came out steadier, because it was the truest thing I knew. I don't need to be perfect, I said. I need to be dependable. I need to show up. She wrote something down. No dramatic reaction. No emotional speech. Just notes. And somehow I appreciated that. Because this wasn't therapy. This was evaluation. Truth mattered more than performance. Then came the financial review. And honestly, that part was brutal in its own way. I was now a single-income teacher in a 2-bedroom apartment without the financial cushion of a partner. No dual support structure. On paper, I was undeniably a more complicated applicant than before. But I had planned for this dream long before Adrian ever entered the picture. I showed them my adoption savings account. $18,000 I had built slowly over 3 years. Not glamorous savings. Not trust fund money. Careful money. Teacher money. The kind built through saying no to vacations, unnecessary purchases, impulsive luxuries. I showed spreadsheets, monthly budgets, emergency reserves, projected childcare estimates, every practical calculation I could think of. The social worker smiled slightly at the spreadsheets. Apparently, adoption professionals appreciate organized anxiety. That part almost made me laugh. The process moved slowly after that, painfully slowly. Weeks turned into months. References had to be resubmitted. My foster parents, my principal, 2 coworkers, a longtime friend. More paperwork, more waiting. And through all of it, I kept bracing for another sabotage attempt, another lie, another sudden disruption. It never came, not because Adrian had become a better person, because legal consequences had apparently made dishonesty less appealing. His mother called one more time during that stretch. Different tone this time. Less aggressive. Still unwelcome. Did you really send a legal letter? Yes. You're trying to ruin his life. No, I said evenly. I'm protecting mine. He made mistakes. I almost responded immediately, but stopped myself. Because calling deliberate repeated sabotage a mistake felt dishonest. Mistakes happen once, I said finally. Repeated calculated choices or something else. She exhaled sharply. You've become cold. That almost amused me. Because women become cold the moment they stop absorbing damage politely. I gave your son honesty for years, I said. He answered with sabotage. Silence. Then quietly. He loved you. I looked at the wall for a second before answering. No, I said. He loved being chosen. And I hung up. After that, she stopped calling. Months passed. Slowly, pain stopped feeling sharp all the time. Not because it disappeared. Because it changed shape. At first, betrayal feels like active injury. Then eventually, it becomes information. Something you understand rather than relive. Then, one Thursday afternoon in March, I was helping a student after school when my phone rang. Agency number. Everything in me went still. Not fear exactly. Something more electric than that. Hope. Trying very hard not to become expectation. I stepped into the hallway and answered. Melissa's voice sounded warmer than usual. Natalie? Yes? A pause. Then, congratulations. My breath caught instantly. Your application has been approved. For a second, I genuinely couldn't speak. Not because I didn't understand the sentence. Because I had imagined that moment so many times, and somehow none of the imagined versions prepared me for the real one. I was standing in a fluorescent public school hallway while 2 teenagers argued about a missing pencil, and my life had just changed. It felt absurd. And perfect. Melissa repeated it, smiling audibly now. You're officially in the waiting pool. I leaned against the wall because my knees had abruptly become unreliable. A student walked past, glanced at my face, and asked, Miss Mercer, are you okay? I laughed and cried at the same time, which probably looked alarming. Yes, I said, I'm okay. I was more than okay. I was terrified, relieved, overwhelmed, hopeful, emotionally wrecked, all at once. And somehow, for the first time in a very long time, all of those feelings felt like movement instead of damage. That night, I sat in my apartment with a bottle of cheap sparkling cider because I didn't have actual champagne. And somehow that felt exactly right. Nothing about this journey had looked polished. Nothing about it had been elegant. It had been paperwork and anxiety and legal consultations and heartbreak and forcing myself to function through emotional exhaustion. So celebrating with something slightly pathetic and entirely affordable felt honest. I called my foster parents first. My foster mother cried immediately. Not graceful tears. Full emotional crying before I had even finished saying, I got approved. My foster father handled it the way older men sometimes do, when they're emotional and trying not to be obvious about it, clearing his throat too much, pretending to be focused on practical questions. When does the waiting officially start? What happens next? Do they give you timelines? I smiled through tears the entire conversation. The next morning, my principal hugged me before first period. One coworker brought terrible supermarket donuts and announced they were victory donuts, which somehow made them taste better. For a brief moment, life felt light. Not because everything was solved, because something meaningful had survived. After everything Adrian had done, I was still here. Still approved. Still moving forward. But the story didn't end with approval, because real life rarely wraps itself neatly the moment you think the emotional climax has arrived. About 6 weeks later, my attorney called. His tone was casual in a way that immediately made me suspicious. Just giving you an update. About what? The agency complaint. I sat down instinctively. Apparently, major life developments had trained me to seek nearby furniture. What complaint? The complaint the agency filed regarding Adrian's interference. I went very still. Melissa had warned me the agency took knowingly false interference seriously. But warnings feel abstract until consequences become real. What happened? The agency escalated the complaint. I said nothing. He continued. Because of Adrian's conduct during the adoption process, a professional ethics review was opened. I stared at the wall in my kitchen. What does that mean exactly? It means the outcome could affect his professional standing. I let that sit for a second, then asked the question I already knew mattered. Because of his job? Yes. Adrian's certification body had been notified, and depending on the findings, the consequences could range from a formal reprimand to professional discipline. I thanked my attorney, hung up, and sat in silence for a long time. Not triumphant. That's important. Stories love revenge moments. Clean emotional justice. A satisfying sense that the villain finally got what they deserved, and the hero gets to smile dramatically into the sunset. Real life rarely feels like that. Did I believe consequences were appropriate? Yes. Did I feel some vindication? Of course. But there was no celebration in that moment. Because despite everything, Adrian had once been someone I loved enough to imagine raising a child with. That history doesn't evaporate just because trust does. Pain can coexist with clarity. About a month later, Adrian's mother called again. I almost ignored it. Then answered. The difference in her voice was immediate. Gone was the sharp certainty. Gone was the superiority. She sounded smaller somehow. Did you know about the review? Yes. Silence. Then quietly. Can you stop it? I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because the irony was overwhelming. For months I had been framed as dramatic, vindictive, unreasonable, and now suddenly I was expected to be powerful enough to fix consequences I hadn't created. I can't. You must have some influence. I don't. The agency escalated it. The review is already in motion. I'm not controlling any of this. He could lose his career. I looked out the apartment window for a moment before answering. He could have told me the truth. Silence. A long one. Then finally, in a much quieter voice than I had ever heard from her, he should have. That was it. No apology. No dramatic confession. No emotional reconciliation. Just that one sentence. And honestly, it was enough. Not because it fixed anything. Because it was the first honest thing anyone in his family had said about what happened. After that, the calls stopped completely. And life shifted into a different kind of waiting. Because approval isn't the ending. Approval is just permission to hope differently. The real waiting begins afterward. My profile was officially active. Somewhere, caseworkers could see my information. Somewhere, birth parents could review profiles. Somewhere, decisions could be made that might alter my entire life. Or nothing might happen for months. That uncertainty has its own emotional weight. I rebuilt my profile completely. No Adrian. No couple narrative. No staged shared future. Just me. A teacher. A foster care survivor. A financially modest but stable woman with an organized life, a support system, and an enormous stubborn capacity to endure. I remember staring at the final profile packet longer than I should have. Because there's something surreal about seeing your life condensed into a format designed for strangers to evaluate. This is who I am. This is what I can offer. Please choose me. It's an emotionally strange thing to ask of the world. Weeks passed, then months. And in that waiting, I realized grief and hope can live in the same body at the same time without canceling each other out. Some days I felt peaceful. Some days unexpectedly furious. Some days hopeful enough that it physically hurt. One afternoon after work, I was grocery shopping when I saw a father crouch beside his daughter in the cereal aisle, listening with complete seriousness as she explained why one cartoon mascot was clearly superior to another. She couldn't have been older than 6. And I had to turn my cart away because my eyes suddenly filled with tears. Not because I was sad exactly, because I wanted that kind of ordinary, that deeply ordinary intimacy. The kind people take for granted. The bedtime negotiations, homework arguments, the weird cereal debates, the ordinary chaos of being someone's safe place. I still wanted it. That part had survived. And then one afternoon, Melissa called, not with a match. Just an update. My profile had been viewed. That was all she could say. No guarantees, no specifics, just viewed. And somehow, that tiny scrap of information hit me harder than approval had. Because suddenly the possibility felt real in a new way. Someone had looked. Someone somewhere had seen me, seen my story, seen my face, seen the life I had built. Maybe they kept scrolling. Maybe they paused. Maybe they considered me for 30 seconds and moved on forever. I had no way of knowing. But the fact that someone had looked at all was enough to make my heart race for days. Hope changes shape like that. It doesn't always arrive dramatically. Sometimes it arrives quietly and refuses to leave. Then, one Tuesday afternoon, after dismissal, my phone rang again. Agency number. And this time, everything changed. The second I saw the agency's number, something inside me went completely still. Not fear. Not exactly. It was something sharper than that. The kind of hope you almost don't want to touch because you're afraid acknowledging it will somehow ruin it. I stepped into the hallway outside my classroom and answered on the second ring. Natalie? Melissa's voice sounded different this time. Still professional, but softer somehow. Yes. There was a small pause. Then she said, "We have a potential match." For a moment, the hallway seemed to tilt around me. Not metaphorically. Actually. The hallway around me blurred a little at the edges, and I had to lean one hand against the wall to steady myself. Melissa explained carefully that this was still early. Nothing final. No guarantees. A birth mother had reviewed several profiles, and mine was one she wanted more information about. That was all. A very small development in practical terms. But emotionally, it felt enormous. Because after all those months of silence, uncertainty, and trying to stay emotionally balanced, this was the first undeniable sign that somewhere, someone real had looked at the life I'd built and paused. I thanked Melissa more times than was probably necessary, then ended the call and just stood there in the hallway with my hand over my mouth, trying very hard not to completely lose emotional control beside a bulletin board covered in outdated science fair announcements. That night, I sat on the floor in the second bedroom. I wasn't trying to be dramatic. I genuinely didn't know what else to do with all that hope. The room was still mostly empty by design. I had refused to decorate too specifically because I didn't know who might eventually belong there. An infant would need something entirely different than a school-aged child. I didn't want to build a fantasy so specific that reality would have no room to breathe. But sitting there that night, for the first time, the room felt less hypothetical, less symbolic, more like a space waiting for an actual person. A few days later, the agency asked for updated availability information. Then silence. Then another call. The birth mother had chosen another family. I wish I could tell you I handled that gracefully. I didn't. The grief surprised me with its intensity, because logically, I understood what had happened. Nothing had ever been promised. Nothing had been official. No child had been placed with me. No relationship had begun. And yet the disappointment felt heartbreakingly real, because hope had already started quietly making room. I cried harder than I expected that night. Not because I thought something had been stolen from me, because I had briefly imagined something beautiful and then had to gently let it go. The next morning, I still went to work. Because life is relentlessly ordinary, even when your emotional world feels temporarily unsteady. Children still needed help with spelling tests. Lesson plans still existed. Lunch duty still happened. One of my students still forgot his homework and offered a deeply unconvincing explanation involving a dog and a cousin. Life kept moving. And eventually, so did I. Several more weeks passed after that. Long enough for the disappointment to soften into something quieter. Long enough for me to stop checking my phone every few minutes. Then another inquiry came. Then another. Then more silence. That became the rhythm of that season. Brief moments of possibility followed by long stretches of uncertainty. And somewhere in that cycle, I realized something important. I had already changed. Not because motherhood had happened yet, because resilience had deepened. Adrian had tried to derail me emotionally, professionally, and practically. He had tried to make this process collapse under the weight of chaos. Instead, the opposite happened. I became harder to shake, clearer, more certain. One Sunday afternoon, Melissa called again. The moment I answered, I heard something different in her voice. Careful optimism. "Natalie, are you somewhere you can sit down?" My heart slammed so hard it actually hurt. "Yes." A pause. Then, "There's a child." Everything inside me went silent. The kind of silence that happens when your body is trying to process something emotionally overwhelming faster than your mind can translate it. Melissa explained carefully. A young child. Emergency placement circumstances. Complicated background. Still early. Still evaluation. Still no guarantees. But my profile had been identified as a strong fit for consideration. I asked questions immediately. Probably too many. Health concerns. Timeline. Placement structure. Legal uncertainty. Transition expectations. Melissa answered what she could and gently redirected what she couldn't. But honestly, I barely remember parts of that conversation. Not because it wasn't important. Because my nervous system had basically exploded. This was no longer theoretical. No longer some distant someday fantasy. There was a real child already somewhere in the world. After the call ended, I walked slowly to the second bedroom and opened the door. The late afternoon light was coming through the blinds in soft stripes across the floor. Nothing about the space had physically changed, and yet it felt entirely different. Because suddenly, maybe the person meant for that room already existed. Maybe they were somewhere scared, somewhere confused, somewhere in transition. Maybe they were sitting with strangers the way I once had. That thought hit me so hard I had to sit down. I thought about 7-year-old me in the back seat of that social worker's car, clutching a trash bag and trying not to cry, because crying felt like making things harder for adults who already seemed tired. I thought about how many children learned far too early how to make themselves emotionally small. And before I even realized I was speaking out loud, I whispered into the quiet room, "I'm coming." Not because I knew this match would work. Not because anything had been promised. Because for the first time, the possibility felt close enough to speak to. As for Adrian, the certification review was still unresolved the last I heard. He still apparently tells some version of the story where he was misunderstood. That version of the story helps him live with himself. It has nothing to do with me anymore. That chapter ended the day I chose truth over comfort. He believed sabotage would be enough to end this future before it began. He was wrong. Because the truth is, people who survive unstable childhoods often learn endurance long before they should have to. We learn patience in ugly ways. We learn how to keep hoping even when hope feels irrational. We learn how to continue moving forward while carrying uncertainty. I'm 35 years old. I'm a middle school special education teacher. I make $56,000 a year. I have a clean record, a rebuilt future, a home with space waiting, and more persistence than I ever realized. Maybe by the time this story reaches someone else, that room won't be empty anymore. Maybe it still will. But either way, this part remains true. Once, I was the child waiting for someone to choose me. Now I am the adult refusing to stop choosing back. Whatever happens next, this much is true. He didn't destroy the future he tried to take from me.